Welcome to another episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor.
Welcome, everybody, again to another episode of our show, bringing another really fascinating guest today involved in science and technology, creating a better tomorrow for all of us. Today on the show, we have the honor of being joined by Marc Elia, who is the founder of M28 Capital, a healthcare sector investment fund, as well as the chairman of the board of Invivyd, a really interesting biopharmaceutical company. They're devoted to delivering protection from a range of serious viral infectious diseases, beginning with SARS-CoV-2, deploying a really interesting and proprietary integrated technology platform focused on best-in-class monoclonal antibodies. Just last year, in March 2024, the company received emergency use authorization from the FDA for one of the monoclonal antibodies in its pipeline. Marc has a strong passion for investing in and developing these innovative healthcare solutions, dedicated much of his career to making these meaningful differences in human health, as well as advocating for the development of therapies that address significant unmet medical needs. Prior to M28, Marc served as a partner in a Bridger Capital, an investment fund, and served on the board of many biotech companies. And then prior to his time in the healthcare investment space, served in both strategy and corporate development roles at groups like Chiron, in business development at Protein Sciences Corp, also as in consulting at L.E.K, did his undergraduate degree in economics from Carleton College. A lot to get into today, a lot of really cool topics. Honored to have him. Marc Elia, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great having you. Marc, before we get into COVID and long COVID and monoclonal antibodies and all that, I would love to hand you the floor for a little bit, just to talk a little bit more about you. I love when I hear stories. I mean, I came up in the pharmaceutical industry myself, but I love hearing sort of the transition stories between pharma and the consulting, and ultimately I was called the tougher role, or the more blood pressure raising role of biotech VC. Tell us a little bit about your background, if you would.
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. So I got my start a little bit by accident back in the 90s, in that, like a lot of kids, I had spent my summers mowing lawns and painting fences. And at a certain point, my parents, had given me the strong advice that you got to do something productive with your life. And my father had a way of thinking about the world that I admired at the time. And he suggested to me that you find something very complicated with obvious value to people, and then just spend your whole life learning. And don't worry about the details, just get going. And it so happened that a family friend at the time, and this is in 96, was the CEO and one of the big investors in a local Connecticut biotech company called Protein Sciences Corporation, which ultimately was bought by Sanofi for having a flu vaccine that is today marketed as Flublok. And so my first job that involved, not sweating in the outdoors, was spending a summer there, learning the industry, doing, they asked me to do some little projects that I did, but I got to spend time in the lab, running gels, looking over sequencing results for plasmids that were going to go make something or other in a cellular system. And even as an econ major, I was totally entranced. This is before the first draft of the human genome, but the sense of possibility was palpable in that environment. And it remains so today, right? These are companies that are actually looking at what defines humanness, human wellness, disease, and working for solutions for people. So I kind of decided, maybe a little impulsively, that this was going to be the thing I was going to do. And I further decided that, a formal education in the subject matter was a waste of my time. And that was probably pure hubris or stupidity or both. I don't know. But it turned out that everything was changing so fast that over the next 10 years, having spent, oh, I don't know, probably 5,000 very precious dollars at the time on textbooks on what was then young Amazon.com,
Yeah.
I found a way to learn enough to be dangerous. And I constructed a career in biosciences through some of those stops you mentioned. And some of those stops are still resonant and interesting to me today. Chiron, for those of you with a real long industrial memory, was
Oh,
sort
yeah.
of the third West Coast biotech after Genentech and Amgen, but the only biotech ever with two Nobel Prizes, one
Mhm.
for Hep C, which came homegrown, and one that candidly was bought from Cetus Corp, which employed a guy named Kerry Mullis, who got high on acid and invented PCR. So you kind of learn and steep yourself in this history. And the whole way through my career, I just tried to fight through, the central concept that I think is essential to all great biomedicine. What is it really that makes a great medicine? And how do you go find them? And if you're lucky enough to find one or dream them up, how do you get it from an idea into something with a vial and or a blister pack or a label, or something that will actually change human outcomes? So throughout my career, I've just remained passionate about looking for that intersection of what I think of as high plausibility, right? I want to know what makes for a good medicine, because there sure are a lot of bad ones or things that'll never see the light of day. And I wanted to be very certain that when I went to work on something, it would really matter. And there have been times in the pharmaceutical industry where we lose track of those things. I think of companies like Valiant, and I kind of think to myself, well, I don't know if they were focused really on medicine and changing outcomes more than changing bottom line dynamics. But I suppose I worship at that altar of George Merck, right? You put patients first and profits follow. And so whether I've been working in a company or on a board or at an investment firm, it really, your vantage point changes, but the mission never should, right? Our job is to combine, technology, capital, and acumen, and make people healthier. And if you do that, and you do it with a pretty stringent eye for quality, hopefully, good things follow. And over my career, I've been fortunate to be in and around early medicines that have made big impacts. People who may remember Pharmacyclics. At Bridger, we were a big shareholder. Or Alnylam, I was very close with the team at Alnylam, and I think I'm in a little YouTube video they made called The Believers, which is hilarious, and my family likes to make fun of me for. But all of that sort of brought me to wanting to get a little closer to motivating outcomes that I believed in. And that was really why I started my own investment firm, M28. So, there are a lot of people out there that are kind of, pure stock pickers, and they spend their time on the phone chit-chatting with each other and KOLs trying to debate which stock will go up or down. I try to take a longer view and use capital to actually motivate outcomes that I believe in, and that I can find, peers and companies that believe in. And that's really what brought me to ultimately what is Invivyd today. But like I said, you know, so much has changed in the industry, and I mean, gosh, in America, and I've certainly gotten older and less fit along the way. But in the end, those same fundamental things remain true. I wake up every morning jazzed to put together whatever circumstances are required to make people live longer, better, and trust that that will ultimately generate value for both patients, shareholders, et cetera. So that's the overlay. I don't know if that's on point with what you're asking, but it's what was stimulated, because listening to everything you said, I'd forgotten some of it, and I found it exhausting to hear. So I must be getting old.
No, no, it's an awesome background story. You had me smiling there for a minute because before his passing several years ago, I had the chance to work with Fred Frank, and he always used to talk about Cetus and Chiron and bring up the old days, and it just you got me longing for the days of yore
Oh,
and
yeah.
what the industry used to be back. But anyway, we'll save that for another episode. But yeah, no, it's a great journey, Marc, that you've been on in creating companies, focusing on unmet medical needs. But one thing additionally, and I'd love you to talk about it a little bit. We talk about dementia, we talk about cancer. We don't usually interview patients, but you, in addition to an investor and a company builder, you're also one of the patients with an unmet medical need, in this case, long COVID. You wrote an op-ed piece recently, a couple of months ago, in something called the Sick Times, talking about, hey, you're a triathlete and an endurance athlete, and hey, it could really turn your life around. And I'd love for you just to say a few words about that. We'll get into some of the regulatory
Yeah,
issues a little
sure.
later on in the
Of
episode,
course.
but talk a little bit about this as well.
I'm happy to. And what's particularly wild is that, of course, when I first got involved in COVID, and indeed this company, Invivyd, none of that was true. So I accidentally became a person who I hope in the future could really benefit from more work in this space. I have kids that are, well, gosh, now they're 15 and 13, but in 2021 they were whatever that was, a few years younger, and they were like everyone going back to school, and the world had started to sort of relax to some extent about COVID. And again, I had a pretty good appreciation early for the idea that this would be a problem and a perpetual problem, even in its endemic phase. But by virtue of my knowledge and habits, I'd stayed safe, and I'd really hoped to continue. But I think there was a birthday party at one point, and one of the kids came home feeling not so great, and I wasn't paranoid enough, and I ended up with COVID. And my course of COVID-19 was during the Delta wave. Like a lot of people, I think a clinician would have looked at me and said, "Well, you've got mild to moderate," meaning it was a rough ride. It was not really like a cold I'd ever had before. It was worse, but I was never in danger. My O2 sats didn't plummet. I didn't end up hospitalized for COVID. What ended up happening was about 10 days later, I was gifted bilateral pulmonary emboli, and so I woke up pretty sure I was dying because I'd never felt quite what that feels like. I drove myself to the hospital and checked myself right on in. And, a couple hours later, I was on a heparin drip, and a very nice, critical care doc was explaining to me that everything's going to be fine because I was here. But, some things would change. And of course, they did. What I didn't expect, even after that, was that there was a very clear taking by COVID of a lot of aspects of my wellness. So some people in the long COVID community, and I identify as one of those people, will describe things. They'll describe, exercise intolerance, or what's called post-exertional malaise, autonomic dysfunction. So what'll happen to some of us, and fortunately, I am far from the worst end of the spectrum on this, is that the very act of revving up your heart even a little bit, like a brisk walk, or God help you if you run, it'll take about 10 days sometimes to go back to feeling normal. I'll immediately feel horribly ill, inflamed, coughing, exhausted, palpitations, it's as if you suddenly had your body replaced with a very old rickety body that doesn't want to operate correctly. So, I think over years I've learned to treat myself a little more gingerly. So, you're sort of forced into this awful choice of like, well, do I want to be really unfit or really unwell? And, generally you'd choose unfit, because I don't think fit's really even an option. But, one of the problems in the long COVID area is that there is still not a particularly satisfying understanding of what is exactly going on. Some people believe there's residual virus, and there's some interesting data along those lines. Some people believe that there's damage that has ensued, whether it's at the level of the brainstem or the endothelium or whatever. Some people believe there's combinations of all of these, all of it, by the way, confounded by the fact that for people who have long COVID, it's pretty hard to avoid getting COVID over and over and over again, like everybody else. So, I think that part of my journey has only made a little more urgent, and probably a good bit more personal, Okay, some of the things that I would ordinarily be working on out of pure academic interest and passion, right? It was one thing to really like new medicines and changing outcomes before I thought, holy smokes, I got to figure this thing out because I don't want to die, right? And so that is a different overlay that I'm sure from time to time irritates my colleagues and drives my family to distraction. But I think in the end, it's sort of an inevitable consequence. And of the experience. And at least as I've understood the data, I am far from alone. There are millions of Americans right now all looking for answers. And right now, most of what we know are these sort of vague biological hints. And, I guess, yeah, the idea that a short dose of Paxlovid may not help you. But, 5, 10, 15 days of drug for a syndrome that is debilitating humans for months to years at a time. I think we're just in the very, very early innings of understanding what this thing is a lot of us are dealing with and what to do with it. So, look, it does again dovetail with the central mission of the company, which is, to my eye, still the best advice I can think to give is don't get COVID. So if I can move that needle, I'm happy to do even just that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Excellent. Excellent. And along those lines, and again, so here we are, 2025, and again, I think back into the days, my early days in the industry, when that top 10, that top 20 list of pharma was the Lipitors and Viagras and all that stuff. Now it's all monoclonal antibodies, global monoclonal antibody market somewhere about $250 billion now, projected to be up to $500 billion in the next 10 years or so. And very interesting. While a lot of those products, cancer focused, immuno-oncology, autoimmune, the principle of monoclonal antibodies in infectious diseases and sort of one of the holy grails, which you're focusing on, is this concept of mutational escape. And you at Invivyd, and I'll let you run with this because I'm going to talk out of turn, are focusing on basically understanding, and we actually just touched on this a few weeks ago. We talk about sort of these epitopes on various targets that might not be the dominant ones, but maybe great targets for monoclonal antibodies to prevent that type of escape when we're dealing with viruses or microbes or whatever the case may be. Talk a little bit about this platform you put together, because it's really cool in terms of the modeling, the discovery, and ultimately how you're engineering some of these new sort of generation of monoclonal antibodies to think out of the box to this problem.
Yeah, happy to. And look, you've already touched on so many of the interesting facets of the industry because, of course, MABs are in part responsible for the rise of biotech as an industry, right? Going back to Genentech and so forth. And it's in some ways the most intuitive thing in the world, right? What is a human antibody suite after all? Natively, it's largely that bit of the adaptive immune system educated by a pathogen and willing to serve. Now, in the pharmaceutical industry, pathogens can be tough because they mutate, because sometimes they're just poorly druggable. And yet, one of the earliest ever MABs, do you remember Synagis? Pemivibart, of course, is an RSV MAB. Now, I think it still sells, but it's largely been exceeded by Beyfortus, nirsevimab, and other innovations in the RSV antibody space. But there was a 20-year gap. Let me think about that. Was it 20? I think it was more. A 23 or so year gap between Synagis and then the first COVID MABs. Yeah. And over that time, no one had really elaborated a target or made a platform to address infectious disease because, number one, there are other ways to deal with other pathogens. So, Hep C, of course, polymerase, nucleotide analogs that are polymerase inhibitors are transformational. Elsewhere in virology, nukes and protease inhibitors and so forth are great treatments. But for ID, preventing disease with an antibody is often, I think one could argue, almost more ideal, if you want to say it that way, than even educating your immune system with a vaccine. So you see that very clearly in RSV, by the way, right? We now have RSV vaccines for, people like you and me. But for our most vulnerable citizens, preemies and babies, we will commonly reach for an antibody because it's available instantly, equitably, on demand as high quality protection. So when we looked at COVID, a lot of us, and this is back in 2020, appreciated that we were likely to end up in a scenario that looked more like RSV and less than maybe other things. And the reason was this, for whatever reason, humans are highly susceptible to repeat infections with coronaviruses. So if you look at the so-called endemic, the previous endemic for coronaviruses, OC43, and I forget the HK, something or other, people get them over and over again. And, SARS-CoV-2, when it arose, carried this really unfortunate set of properties. It was a coronavirus. You might anticipate that you would have problems with reinfection, but it was also incredibly, incredibly problematic medically, right? And so you were sitting in this kind of unhappy zone in which you could imagine people were going to pass these things around, and it would never get to the point you could never vaccinate your way fully out of the problem. Not unusual in respiratory viruses anyway.
Right.
And SARS-CoV-2 would have the problem of very fast waning of titers elicited through vaccination. So a lot of us thought, well, the logical thing to do then is to approach it with a monoclonal. And you saw a lot of big companies do that, right? AZ, Regeneron, et cetera. Well, little Invivyd had its first antibody, which did not make it all the way through clinical trials, adintrevimab. But what was important about our company and different from those others is the way we approach the tech. Okay, it's a lot of complicated, kind of cool stuff that I'd rather not go into in too much depth, because just in case somebody with a lot of money and an interest in competing with us is listening, I'd rather not help. But the sum of it really is this, right? We don't ask a mammal, like a mouse. You might often inoculate a mouse to get an antibody, or you might ask a mammal like a human. You might gather blood and look for the antibody you're interested in human serum. We're not asking those kinds of systems to give us our antibodies. We're actually engineering and affinity maturing them from a common early scaffold. And the reason that's important is this. Ever since Omicron, I think everyone's been generally aware that SARS-CoV-2 is, quote, evasive, right? It has shed its classically antigenic spots. And so its evolutionary journey has been to avoid the pressure of mammalian and human antibodies. And, it's not just humans, right? It's deer and mink, and because we've filled every possible reservoir on Earth in the space of about a year. And so, yeah, you sort of alluded to this in the intro. The benefit of doing things the way we do them is that it affords us access to spots on the target that most mammalian immune systems don't seem to like to go. And therefore, we're doing that, right, to take advantage of the consequence. If there's no pressure on a certain spot, it's not all that likely to move. And indeed, if you look at Pemivabart, which is the antibody that is our currently authorized drug, the epitope that Pemivabart hits has not moved structurally since Omicron. And you kind of go, all right, well, let's think about what that means. So first of all, I don't think you could theoretically, by the way, there's probably some human somewhere on Earth that actually made Pemivabart naturally in response to infection or vaccination. We'll never find him or her, but that person could exist. The consequence of our work is, we're essentially repeatedly and serially driving our medicines towards that spot, so-called immunorecessive, highly conserved, cryptic, because as the virus continues to move, we believe it's unpressured and accessible. And by the way, effective, right? So, we've done certain studies and we could talk about that. But the point is that capability is bespoke to Invivyd. And, that has sort of like two consequences. I guess one, it makes us the leader. And the other thing is it makes us look weird because, I sometimes wish there were more monoclonals out there. It would just be a category that would seem more normal to people. But I think it's up to us mainly to drive that. And so, look, the tech that gets us that is in effect the combination of a lot of structural acumen and modeling, and then what I think I would call sheer brute force. We are doing effectively combinatorial exploration of the variable region of antibodies, but in a very, very targeted and designed way. So, it might surprise people to consider that we had this old antibody that never even made it all the way through pivotal before it lost activity, okay? That antibody differs from Pemivabart today, our currently authorized active antibody, by 6 amino acids. That's it. It's 99.5% the same thing. And it is driving into and targeting the same spot with a little bit of tweaking. By the way, the next one we are building, and it's in human studies now, is once again 99, I'll just say point X percent. It is effectively let's call it nearly identical to now Pemivibart. The difference is by doing those little tweaks, we're able to increase the potency, 15 plus fold, and it starts to open the possibility of radically scaling what we think we can do with a mAb. So Pemivibart, for your listeners who don't know, yes, it's an authorized antibody currently in clinical use to prevent COVID-19 in certain immunocompromised people. But here's the hitch. By virtue of its potency and by virtue of the development pathway we sort of co-authored with FDA, we use a very, very high dose. That high dose demands that it's an infused drug. That infusion is given quarterly. It is nobody's idea of an ideal medicine. An ideal medicine is, a quick boop in the deltoid and you move on, right? Well, our thought was best to get started and iterate, because as we iterate and the virus iterates alongside us, we feel ever more confident in our ability to put the bat on the ball and, pharmacologically speaking. And our goal would be with the next one to build something that is much more, population and system friendly at a lower price, that would all start to get into that zone where someone could credibly think, hey, wait a minute, maybe this is a functional equivalent to vaccination or even superior. And the reason one would start to think those things is this. If you think about where we've been as a human population, this is the only pathogen in at least my lifetime, and so I'm guessing yours, because I think you're younger than me, just to look at you, is that we've never gone as a species from immunologically naive to all of us experienced. Almost everyone is either vaccinated or has been infected, maybe except for that island off of Australia where they kill you if you go, right? But the rest of us are sort of this like human monoculture that flip-flopped. And as we moved from naive to experienced, well, wouldn't you know it, the incremental effect of a vaccine boost drops, right? Because you're now comparing it to someone whose immune system is already educated. But for a mAb, you don't have that limitation. And in fact, you could argue that it's almost better, because now you're not asking the mAb to do all of the heavy lifting. You're putting the monoclonal on top of an experienced human immune system. So I guess summing up, our view has sort of been consistent now for 5 years, that to control endemic SARS-CoV-2, and there may be other pathogens like it, a monoclonal is practically ideal. All someone would have to do is solve the tech problem. And, so far so good from an Invivyd standpoint. So look, in a future state, years down the road, we would love for our products to be viewed by those people at risk. And whether that's because you're immunocompromised, you're elderly, you're a frontline healthcare worker, if you actually want highest possible quality protection from this and maybe other pathogens, you would look to a mAb that has scaled to the point where it's economically and medically, useful. So that's we're in one way, a bit away from there. But on the other hand, in 3 years, we've moved from having nothing to already we've celebrated our first anniversary of having a commercial product. So I think we're looking to iterate fast and move the technology fast so that we can start to establish functionally equivalent footing with vaccines, right? Because I think this is one area where I think, we know vaccination can fall a little short.
Right. Well, yeah, let's talk about that a little more and that target, because okay, so obviously have the magic of creating the antibodies against these, as you say, these cryptic immunoconserved regions. Yeah, we're looking for a quick boop, but okay, not necessary right away, because this segment of immunocompromised people. And again, what are we talking about here? Lots of things. And you list these on the website. And just, for the audience, people undergoing active, cancer therapies, people undergoing, stem cell treatments, organ transplantation, people on everything from corticosteroids to tumor necrosis factor antibodies to just the broad class of immunodeficiency, including HIV.
Yeah,
And then I'll throw one other thing in here that's not on the website, but it just makes me think, who was the major who died primarily older people, and we talk a lot about this theme of immunosenescence. We forget that, hey, our immune system sort of dissolves away over time normally.
yeah.
So it's a pretty it's a pretty big segment that we don't normally think about. And okay, it would be nice to have the quick boop, but no. Say a few words about this group, because this
Sure.
ultimately then allows you in your clinical studies to say, hey, we're going to test this, but hey, we want to look at what happens in these chronic lymphocytic leukemia patients, or
Yeah.
these folks over here with this other cancer. Interesting, clinical development, ways to model the clinical there.
Well, what I think you see us doing is, as it were, if you'll forgive the analogy, kind of pointing the weapon where it needs to go first,
Mhm.
right? So,
Right.
when you are working through, for example, in collaboration with your care team or your oncologist, CAR T therapy for a refractory DLBCL, or you've been so fortunate to get, having been so unfortunate to need a new pair of lungs.
Yeah.
I think the last thing you need in your life is a ubiquitous pathogen that can take all of that hard work and flush
Agreed.
it along with your well-being and possibly your life down the toilet, right? Overnight. And so, you've got this situation in America in which I think last year it was about 50, 60,000 people died of COVID-19. But of course, if you look at the deaths above, around, and below just those direct deaths, you will see, of course, cardiovascular adverse outcomes, heart attack, stroke, atherosclerotic disease, et cetera. These are syndromes that SARS-CoV-2 exacerbates and accelerates.
Yeah.
And that's before we talk about, truly a set of lungs or a new kidney that you need to function without compromise. And so, if you consider our work, yeah, the people who we believe should be considered most strongly for those protections right now are those people who are most fragile and immunocompromised. Yeah, when you look on the product fact sheet and so forth, you will see this very long list, which begins to approach a reasonable segment of all medicine in America. It's immunomodulatory agents, maybe you're a rheumatologist treating someone with an anti-TNF or so on and so forth. It's not an accident that it's a big group of people, because huge components of modern medicine rely on manipulating or directly ablating your immune system. And so, yeah, our view, and I think the view of the FDA, has been these people need additional help. They do not respond particularly well to vaccination often because some of them just lack a B suite to mount an antibody response to vaccination. And also, they're, of course, medically fragile. So, what's funny about COVID is that the story of its identity has probably been made disproportionately by young, healthy people.
Yeah.
Survivors often feel as though it was no big deal, right? But unfortunately, it's kind of the ultimate ubiquitous toppler, right? If you're in a fragile medical situation, it is oftentimes a real contributor to decline and maybe a true adverse outcome like a death. And the real problem is it is everywhere, almost all the time. And so, yeah, we look at big waves, but even the low lulls imply there is a high degree of SARS-CoV-2 transmission at all times in America. And then occasionally it gets very, very high indeed. So, yes, there are any number of populations today on whom we are focused with Pemivibart, who I think are on enough of a journey already that dealing with this pathogen is, a lot for them to consider. And so, we're honestly honored to serve that need. Uh, to your point, however, they're not alone. So you and I, if we're so lucky to grow old, we will become effectively immunocompromised, right? We won't be defined that way. We'll be defined as elderly. I don't know. It sounds more distinguished as I get gray hair. It sounds almost like a nice thing. But of course, it comes with the consequence of that diminished immune function. And when you look at the data, right, they are prone to having almost as poor of a response to vaccination, and therefore, of course, make up a disproportionate portion of the death and damage caused by SARS-CoV-2. So it's kind of this like recurring theme, right? Meaning, I don't think this is even that uncommon across influenza or RSV. The most vulnerable people bear the brunt of the problem, but our ability and willingness to respond to the problem is too often dictated by people who are disproportionately young and healthy. They'll say, what's the big deal? Or I had COVID and it was no big deal. I mean, hell, there was a good 7 or 8 days in 2021 when I felt that way. I had COVID. What's the big deal? And then you wake up even in your middle 40s, right? Thinking, okay, I'm like, I got a pretty good VO2 max right now. And you find out the hard way, oh, it's a big deal, right? And I'm a lucky person. So yes, look, right now Invivyd serves that population. And I think we will always be thrilled to serve that population. And I just think, to your point, there are a great many Americans. I mean, strictly immunocompromised is like 10 million Americans. And elderly is what, 30? You very quickly get into, yes, literally every one of us knows multiple people who I think could benefit from additional protection. And we're going to aim to serve as many of them as we can.
Excellent. Yeah. Again, I wanted the audience to appreciate again the scale and sort of the diversity of what fits into that immunocompromised a class. So no, I appreciate that. Marc, talk a little bit about the portfolio and the sort of the clinical experience. I mean, again, you have the emergency use authorization for Pemivabart. You have another sort of earlier candidate, something called VYD 2311, that is coming along in earlier clinicals. I know you have the ability to do different types of immunobridging studies and this and that. And I'm going to shut up because I'm not a clinical development guy. But walk us through a little bit about
Sure.
the EUA, but then also what's coming down the pike in the portfolio.
Yeah, and I appreciate that it's also, by the way, not straightforward, because I think we, in concert and in partnership with the FDA, have been managing through what is effectively a transition phase. So Invivyd, I guess I came back to the board in July of 22, and it was in the second half of 2022 in which we approached the FDA and proposed some of what we intended to do with what is now today Pemivibart. And I think if you can put your head back in 2022, it was a strange time. Paxlovid was brand new. And the world had just kind of started to understand that, we might be vaccinating a lot for the rest of our lives if we're going to manage this down. Because remember, back in 2020, it was prime and boost, and then you're good to go. And then it was kind of like, oh, wait, we're going to need to do another one. And then it was kind of like, oh, wait, we're going to. So the world was evolving, and yet also almost every industrial company, Invivyd included, had struggled with viral evolution from a mAb perspective. And so there were a bunch of meetings and discussions among industry, academics, the regulators, and so forth. And there was a clear framework that emerged. And I think, frankly, Invivyd helped drive some of it through our own work, which was, at the time, the FDA's interest set was in indeed prophylaxis, so-called PrEP, pre-exposure prophylaxis, for immunocompromised people via antibody. And when an innovator came to them, they would say, all right, let's do immunobridging, which is kind of a form of bioequivalence, right? If you've ever looked at a predicate drug and then a prototype, and you kind of compare them. And so that is what, in effect, we did. We in the FDA looked at our old drug, adintrevimab, which, even though by the end of the study it was inactive or poorly active, it had successfully completed a global multi-center RCT for PrEP. And so the FDA could look at that and go, all right, in this part of your study, this level of antiviral activity from this mAb generated this clinical benefit. Go ahead with Pemivibart, give us that level of antiviral activity or better. And, look, that's a pretty high bar. I remember saying many, many times at the time, this is a little nuts because they're asking that the old ceiling be the new floor. But that is the math, and we did our best. And what that resulted in was a filing, a regulatory filing we made toward end of 23 into early 24 under EUA. And that EUA was granted. Now, over that time, actually, indeed, before that and during and now still, we have learned a lot about COVID and the relationships that have been defined clinically between antiviral activity and clinical benefit, right? It's not really all that different than other indications in which you might use a surrogate marker, right? We can approve a drug based on LDL reduction and learn later what the outcomes benefit would be, right? So I think Pemivabart was made using that sort of transitional phase construct. There was sort of pandemic thinking, I guess I would say, imbued into that. I think on a go-forward basis, I don't think EUA is particularly, useful or appropriate. I think to our eye, using those surrogates to prosecute accelerated approval is an extremely logical next step for the field. And it's, I think, particularly true for Invivyd antibodies, because again, they're about 99.5% the same each time we make a new one. So not all that much is changing. And we have some pretty good, slick modeling that would show you with a reasonable confidence, okay, at such and such a level, I don't know if this will be, 78 or 82% protective over symptomatic disease, but both of those are like extremely good numbers, right? So like, I'm not sure how much anyone will care if we do go on later to prove that. So when you look at our portfolio, first, yes, in COVID, the desire would be to continue to iterate with 2311 and then beyond until we're putting up those sorts of drugs that get the similar job done. Very high antiviral activity, very nice half-life, makes kind of a good drug profile, right? You might consider like, I get one boop every 6 months down the road, or even once a year, and I'm okay. And in fact, we would be shooting for a very, very high level of protection, right? That's the goal in COVID. And 2311 is already in humans. So we are looking to wrap up our dose escalation and first in human that would give us most of that information. Safety, albeit in small numbers, but safety, antiviral activity, and half-life. You take all of that, I can more or less predict what the ultimate clinical benefit will be. And our plan would be to take that to the agency, which is, as you may or may not be aware, in some state of evolution as we speak. And I think what we would look forward to saying to them is, listen, like, if you simply take the basic principles from vaccination, where we would remind the major goal is actually to educate the B suite and elicit antibody production, and you apply those same principles to monoclonals, which I think are actually a much more advantaged modality in an immunologically experienced population, we can start to scale really nicely for the benefit of a lot of people in need. So we'll look forward to having that conversation with 2311 and going forward. The other nice thing you point out is that SARS-CoV-2, evolutionarily speaking, is a bear of a target. It is moving a lot. There are more, let's call them stable, relatively speaking, even ID targets that we look at and have done some early work on, and stay tuned. I hope we're in a position to have some news in the future, but in which I think our basic point of view would be identical. Here's a pathogen. It will, almost by definition, disproportionately bother the vulnerable, immunocompromised, the very young, the elderly, and distinguished, I'll just say on my own behalf, hopefully 10, 15 years from now. And we can go places protection-wise in those populations a vaccine will never be able to get you. And so why don't we indeed use this technology to kind of turn the crank and begin to generate a whole pipeline across multiple pathogens that provides, I think, a wonderful and in some ways, certainly in COVID, overdue complement to the broad population health and certainly the preferred modality for the young and healthy, which is, yes, by all means, go vaccinate. But when that's not enough, we can then step in, right? And so you can imagine RSV could be on that list. We've indeed had HCPs reach out to us asking us to make a measles antibody, if you can believe it. And again, maybe a bit of a sign of the times, but not
Yeah.
something that's crazy to contemplate. But,
No.
again, it's another, obviously, the measles vaccine is astoundingly effective, an excellent vaccine. And still, we're seeing some of the limits of relying only on that strategy. And so I think it just paints a picture of an America in which we would love to provide options when options are needed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I like the fact that you have the I mean in at least on the publicly disclosed portfolio, you have an influenza project here, and I think that's yet extremely important that we do not forget that influenza still kills something like 500,000 to 750,000 people a year around the world. And yeah, we do get our vaccine every year, but nonetheless, it's a major killer still. And so I was happy to see that in there. It made me think, Marc, a little bit again, and this goes back to I mentioned this op-ed that you wrote at the beginning of the show, and again, we've done a couple shows on long COVID and a bunch of the different strategies being employed there. Your thoughts again on sort of this class of monoclonal antibodies, ultimately playing a role, whether it is hey. Monoclonals of this nature may be good to sop up, let's say, virus that remains, which may be causing some of this hyperactive immune response. The whole area of immunoregulation and antibodies is so hot now. Your general thoughts on potentially where some of this platform may go beyond the infectious epitopes. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, well, look, I think the major problem I see, and this is really more in my investing life than in Invivyd life, is that we are awash as an industry in interesting modalities, right?
Yeah.
I'm heavily involved in certain genetic medicines. Yeah, I'm sure you're more than aware of
Yep.
RNA based medicines, monoclonal antibodies. You know, when there's a target that is really interesting, that allows us to drive a biology we want, there are often a lot of great ways to consider drugging it. I mean, you're watching this play out in the transthyretin amyloidosis space, right? Where
Oh
an
yeah.
RNA-directed medicine will go head to head with a small molecule. What is interesting to me is that as a general statement, and there will be exceptions, and those exceptions, I would argue, prove the rule, it has been very difficult for a small molecule to displace a biologic. So a
Yeah.
good antibody has tended to drive that biology in a direction people want, maybe with at starting at zero, you would just imagine you have increased odds, right? A better overall risk benefit. And I think the reason's intuitive, right? You are antibody people are total we're just stealing from Mother Nature's best work, right? So when your subject human is awash themselves in their own mAbs, it is not a crazy thought to imagine, yeah, we can drive better outcomes
Yeah.
using that modality. The challenge, of course, comes down to cost.
Sure.
And sometimes cost is modifiable, right? If you have a wickedly potent mAb and you've thought about your target carefully and you are driving the outcome you want with a de minimis quantum of antibody, I think we can get to that point. And infectious disease may be one place where these can be truly population medicines. I don't think there's been one yet. I think the closest people got was the PCSK9 mAbs, which were, Regeneron and Amgen, respectively. I think before the RNAi that is now Leqvio came along, those looked pretty promising as a way to start to use biologics in bigger and bigger populations, right? Secondary prevention, ASCVD, is an awfully big group of humans. So I think to answer your question, I don't know off the top of my head what example to give you as an exquisite mAb target. But one of the things I like about having tech like Invivyd has is that if we are able to do these sort of neat things in our discovery platform that other people aren't, it raises the possibility that we can, just like the rest of the industry, watch what emerges from, GWAS and other big discovery technologies that elaborate targets. And then we can study that target structurally, model the biology, and I mean in vivo and in vitro, and then ask the question, all right, how do we make a best-in-class mAb? Because there's a bunch of biophysical dimensions for any one mAb to outperform on, right? Sometimes something is a monthly injection, then along comes a quarterly. Sometimes something is 500 milligrams, and then along comes 100, and the viscosity changes and the needle changes, and it all gets kind of better. I think we'll be, we have for a small company, we have a pretty full wood chipper right now. But yeah, if you ask where might we innovate and think in 5 years, I don't think anything's off the table. If indeed what we're doing from a discovery remit and capability standpoint actually has put us into advantage territory relative to others. And so far, I think that's what the COVID experience suggests. So, we happen to pick a tough target in a pretty controversial disease area. I don't know that we'll always do that, but it's nice to know that when we win there, I think we start to look constructively at some of these other target areas.
Yep. Yep. Marc, one other thing, and again, I keep coming back to this article, but one of the things that you were stressing in this again, and I know this was a couple of months ago, and it's usually things are changing quite rapidly, but this principle that again, getting out not just to the clinicians and the scientific community, but to patients, that hey, we all demand, whether whatever disease it may be, but in this case, of course, with infectious disease and COVID and long COVID, options.
Yeah.
And HHS, FDA, CDC, NIH, a lot of upheaval. I don't know who's still around anymore, and I profiled a lot of these folks the last couple of years, but just say a couple words, if you would, about the need to make the patient voice heard in this area, but other areas as well. That hey, it's great to have X, but we need Y and Z also.
No, I appreciate it, and look, I'm happy to chat about it because it's such a provocative area, and just look. By way of bias, even as an undergrad, I did my economic thesis was on the 1962 Kefauver-Harris amendment that made the modern FDA, if you can
there you go.
believe. Yeah, it was a lot of fun at parties. But watching this change and then experiencing our journey with FDA through COVID, I think underlines a lot of what can be so great about social change and evolution. And, just like to state it plainly, I'm not politically oriented. I don't belong to a party. And I look at all of this and think, oh boy, this is all kind of wild. But I would say, the work of Jenner on vaccinology is about 250 years old right now. And it has been a miracle, right, for human health. And it's important to say that if you want to make your next statement, but there's always more we can do, and maybe sometimes even better we can do. And I bring that up because I do think what COVID did, and I think all of it was so well intentioned. I mean, humans are flawed, and I think a lot of the behaviors of a lot of us will always be flawed. But I think some of what happened in the public health complex around COVID vaccinology probably set public health back and trust in public health about 50 to 100 years. And if ever you were going to pick a vaccine to mandate, I don't know that you would have picked SARS-CoV-2, knowing everything we know about it now. And I think what has happened is that the automatic reflex has been to default to vaccination, sometimes even at the expense of other modalities. And so to the extent that we now see a pendulum sort of swinging maybe in the other direction, right? People are thinking about what does it mean that Peter Marks has gone from CBER, and what does it mean that they might collapse those centers, and what does RFK Jr. really think about vaccination or whatever? I don't know the answers to any of that, but what I do know is I think the measles vaccine is a miracle, and I think to the extent that it can be used, it should be used. I think when we have, for example, gone to the agency and said, building on the point you raised, for example, we might productively deploy Pemivibart, Pemgarda, in, for example, high-risk people. Maybe they're elderly. Maybe they've had long COVID or they've had a bad experience with vaccination. The FDA attitude was no. The vaccine is adequate for that population you're describing, and therefore we, under statute, can't actually expand your use case. Now, I actually got to read that letter And yes, I was the chairman at Invivyd, but I was also someone pretty pissed, okay? Because I do not personally want to see spike antigen in any form over and over and over again for the rest of my life to stay safe. And so I think the FDA has a real opportunity as it, I guess recongeals with new leadership and generates new thinking and new posture to consider options in a less paternalistic way. And when I say that, what I mean is the following. I told you that I thought a lot about the FDA in the late 90s and how it came to be starting in 1962, right? And if you think about life in 1962, and I didn't enjoy that. I was born in 76. But even if I think about 1982 or 1992, there really was not even a tiny fraction of the information transmission there is today. The rise of evidence-based medicine had barely started. I think someone told me once the first RCT ever was published in 1958 using Acthar for MS exacerbation, if you can believe it. So all of these principles were inchoate and in their infancy and so on. And now you get to today, in which we have a much more sophisticated, in effect, consumer base, I'll call it, HCPs, patients, et cetera, who want to be advocates to at least access options, meaning I'd like to be informed maximally of the possible benefits and possible risks. But after that, I don't know that I need as heavy a hand in the room with me and my doctor, right? And so I think to the extent that there's opportunity going forward for the agency, and I suspect this is sort of the direction of travel for some folks in the new administration, taking a more libertarian approach, which is, hey, we're not going to get as much in the way between you and your options, but we'd like you to be informed. If that's on the agenda, I think it will actually be something that we might celebrate in the end. I don't know that that's true. I'm watching the direction of travel and hoping it might be true, because I think there's clearly some statements that suggest the pendulum is moving away from vaccination above all. I think that's a safe statement. And my hope will be that a consequence of that is to look more constructively at providing people with options. For example, the FDA declined our treatment application via EUA, right? And to my mind, it was sort of like, okay, well, we immunobridged for treatment roughly the way we immunobridged for PrEP. If you're telling me this is a medicine that's safe enough to be used by the well, are you really going to say that people who have no option whatsoever can't access it? That struck me as odd, right? Because it just, something that is useful and worthy in the well, I think has a running start when considering whether or not it might be useful and worthy in the sick. And so look, all of this is, I suppose, given my own journey, it's a little personal, but I think it's also principled and philosophical, right? At a certain level, the search for truth by human beings is laudable and worthy. But if you end up in a place where if you cannot prove literally everything, then you cannot know literally anything, that's actually more toxic than a lot of other directions. So look, I think we're all watching change at HHS, at FDA, and some of that change has been interpreted as quite worrisome. And I think that's not unfair. But what I'm hopeful is that it's maybe less worrisome than people think. And I hope, maybe this is foolish, but I just hope it might be a move toward, the availability of more options. I think Americans have a vaguely libertarian streak. And even though I self-identify as progressive, I got to tell you, if you tell me over and over again what TV show I absolutely need to watch, I guarantee you I'm going to watch it less and less and less. You know what I mean? It's like when someone assures you, you must go to this restaurant, and you go, yeah, I'll pass. Right. So I think COVID and some of those mandates really burned a lot of people out. And now we're at risk of continuing overall decline in health and wellness. And so I think what they, the great they, whoever they are, have to do is move toward a position where there is less finger wagging, shaming, and exhorting, and more provide options. Here you go. You can use these things in concert with your HCP or your care team if you'd like. I think, as painful as it is to get to that place, and it has been, if they go there, that would probably be a good thing for humanity.
Yeah.
So let's find out. I'm hopeful, but then again, I'm an optimist, or I wouldn't do this for a living.
No, I totally agree, and yeah, very very interesting times we're in right now, and yeah, I hope the pendulum swings in the right direction, especially where you're going, because yeah, it's clearly we need to regain that trust, and we need to have options, and again, I love the your philosophy on where you think we should end up. So yeah, I appreciate all you're talking about, Marc. I really do. Um, what else should we be on the lookout for in terms of Invivyd, in terms of you, for as we get further into 2025? Any other public facing stuff while we have you, and anything I missed that you want to mention while we have you today, please?
Yeah, well, no, look, I appreciate the opportunity. Although, I think we've covered a lot. Invivyd is a growing company, and we've just got to wake up every day and execute to the best of our ability. So, whatever unfolds over the balance of the year, our mission is going to be the same. We'd like to get as many people as we can who can and should benefit from Pemivabart. We'd like to, try to drive that growth. We would very much look forward to, in effect, repartnering with whatever the Food and Drug Administration looks like and other regulatory agencies around the world to point out that, we don't have to sit around wishing for alternatives and maybe really interesting protective medicines and indeed treatments for infectious disease. We have them. And so the mission is, how do we scale them together? I'll really look forward to that. And then again, to the extent that we can expand our focus, even what has been a challenging capital market environment for a great many people and a great many companies, I think we'd like to do that. So I hope your listener group will stay tuned, right? We are working all the time, every day. And to the extent that our progress doesn't look all that impressive, I would just take the other side from inside. It is a surprisingly heavy lift to get some of this stuff done. And I think we will look forward to hopefully some relief on those points as, again, the federal government kind of rethinks how it's approaching these disease states. So look, we're completely and utterly bought in on the idea of protecting people. I obviously am personally engaged in it and will stay that way. And I just think we have an extraordinary opportunity to move the art one more turn, and again, the gifts of Edward Jenner and Salk, et cetera, will keep on giving. I'd love to stand on their shoulders as an industry and build even more great stuff to complement and add to the protection we can get via vaccinology. So, again, stay tuned. We're working on it all the time.
Awesome, awesome. Yeah, again, I love the story. It's a credit to how quickly you've moved in this segment. I love hearing about all of it, emergency use. I love hearing about approved products. So I mean, it's a great story. I hope we have an opportunity to do a follow up a little down the road. But really awesome story. Again, for everybody that is going to be listening to this episode of the show across the various podcast networks, so who'll be watching on the YouTube channel. Again, you've been spending time with Marc Elia, chairman of the board, Invivyd, founder, M28 Capital, doing really amazing things to advance these antibody-based therapies for these severe, unmet viral infections. Marc, again, I want to thank you for taking the time out of your schedule today to talk to us for a little while and update us on everything you're doing. Obviously, thank you for what you're doing. And as we like to say on our show, thanks for helping to create a better tomorrow for millions of patients out there via the potential of what you're developing there. Really an awesome story, and I look forward to continue to follow it.
Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Great having you today.